In the last video of Spider Rick that I posted on the channel, which if you don't watch it, go watch it and stuff. I asked you guys if you wanted a more in-depth look on how I created the character of Rick and Morty and Spider-Man mashup in Blender, sort of a tutorial. I guess one or two of you guys replied and seemed kind of interested. Maybe I underestimated how many of you replied. Let me check. Okay, I heard you loud and clear. In this video, I will talk about the making of this character from head to toe and dive in a bit deeper in the creation of the suit, including the modeling of the web, the spider icon, and I will finish up the video talking about how I textured the suit and how I rendered out the character. The methods I used to texture and render Spider Rick are all explained in the texturing course with 7 hours of real-time tutorials that I made, which is called Texturing in Blender for Beginners. If you want a more in-depth look on how to texture and render a character, you can definitely check that course out on my Gumroad. Links will be in the description below. Enjoy. Okay, so first thing, when you are sculpting a character, you need to focus on the likeness and try to figure out the main shapes before you get into details. So I made sure to research the character well. This is Rick from Rick and Morty. Check out my last video, you'll know what I'm talking about. So first thing I did is just checked out the really big shapes. So here we have the egg-like head that he has. We have the big hair spikes over here. I'm just gonna draw a last one right over here. So we have the spikes all over. It separates him from other characters. We have the two big sphere eyes that, take note, are very close to each other. This is important. So the position of everything is important, otherwise you'll end up getting a different looking character. So you can see the separation of the eyes is way smaller than usual. And then we have the noodle nose, which is a bit more obvious from the side. We have the ears that are very close to the eyes and they don't really have any definition, so it's just one shape. And then we have the drool. So this is something the character has in the show with two dots over here. And we have the unified one long noodle eyebrow right over here. And last but not least, let's not forget one of the most iconic things of the show, the eyes. So the pupil over here, as you can see, it has a very weird shape instead of a sphere. Creating the eye shape was quite simple. Let me show you how I did it. So I'm gonna hide the shape over here, the pupil. I'm gonna hit the Shift A button to create a plane. I'm gonna go to Tab for edit mode and then Control Tab to switch to vertex, and then Alt M to merge everything at center. Once you do that, you're gonna have one vertex over here. We're gonna go down and make sure that the icon of snap is activated, so the snap tool over here, and the icon beside it allows us to choose what kind of element we're gonna snap it to. So make sure it's at face so that it snaps to the face of the sphere. Once you do that, by grabbing it with the G button, you can basically snap it on the sphere. So what I'm gonna do here is just quickly create the shape that I showed you earlier of the eyes, like so. And I'm doing that by hitting the E button for extrude, and then at the end I can just grab two vertices and hit the F button to close it off. And then I'm gonna create a quick topology for the subdivision surface that I'm going to add later on, and you can do that by again using the E button to extrude the vertex over here. And we're gonna get something like this, and I'll close it off with F. Once you do that, we'll grab two vertices over here and then hit the F button while moving the mouse around the eye so that it can understand which direction to close it off. So if my mouse is over here, it'll close it to the right. If it's over here, it'll close it downwards. So we're just gonna do that and close the whole thing off. And then I'm gonna close the rest of the shape off with the F button again, like so. And this part as well. Once we do that, let me just deactivate the snap tool. We don't need it anymore. I'm gonna grab the whole thing and I will extrude it with the E button outwards and maybe even scale it a bit. Okay, this is perfect. Once we do that, let me just go out over here. I'm gonna go to the modifier, add a subdivision surface. I can change the view to 2, and if we take a look, there you go, you have the shape, and then you can just easily grab the vertices over here and you can move them around so that you can play with the shape. The drill is actually very simple to do. What you can do is hit the Shift A button, go to meta ball, create a ball, and then with the S button you can scale it down. And once you're done, you can go to edit mode with the tab button and then just use the Shift D button to duplicate it. You can scale it down if you want to and just create the shape that you want for the character. For these separate drills over here, all you gotta do is just grab any meta ball and then duplicate it and put it over here. Make sure that the red area is small enough so that it does not connect to the one beside it, like so. And let me just grab it over here. I'm gonna make it smaller. I can duplicate it and put it on the other side as well. Let me see, right over here. Once I'm done, just hit the tab button again. Alt-C to convert it from mesh to curve metasurf text. Once you do that, you will have the geometry. And then you can simply go to sculpt mode and use the shift button to smooth it out a bit. You can even use the grab button to pull it in and make it closer to the mouth and the chin and everything else. And then once you're done, you're gonna get something like this. As for the hair spikes, what I did is just create a sphere like this. I scaled it down and put it right above the forehead. And then I basically went to sculpt mode and I pulled it to create a shape of a spike. And just to better demonstrate this, I'm gonna go to this one, just grab this one and just delete it. There you go. Okay, so we're gonna continue just pushing the tip to create a spike, and you will notice that I am changing the shape of the brush with the F button to make this tip a bit smaller and have a finer edge at the end. And once you're done creating the shape, you can basically just, if I hit the T button, I can go to tools. You can activate the dynamic topology and just add some details, for example, with the scrape brush, like so. And then you can smooth it out. And once you're done with this, what I like to do, hold on, let me just get this part. What I like to do is just go to the decimate modifier, and this is actually a tip that I did in the video top 10 tips to make it easier to manipulate later on. So I go to the decimate modifier, I change the ratio from 0 to 0.1 or anything else that works with your mesh. Once you do that, let me just go out of the sculpt mode. You can apply it, it will make the mesh less dense, and later on you can just very easily manipulate the shape. And then I basically just duplicated it and then go to edit mode and just change the position like this. And then I'd go back to the sculpt mode and I'd change the form just a bit. And I pretty much did that for the rest of the hair spikes. Okay, so for the rest of the face, it's pretty much good old sculpting. And my channel has a lot of videos on sculpting, so you can check it out. And I also have a sculpting course if you want to go more in depth with that. So let's move from the head to the body. Okay, so for the Spider-Man body, if you watched the last video on this character, I basically explained that I sculpted the character almost pose ready. So if we take a look at the quick rig that I did, let me just rearrange everything to go back to the way it was before I rigged the character. So this is what the character looked like before I changed the position a bit. Now, I would normally advise you guys to create characters in a neutral pose so that when you rig the character, you can have more flexibility in how you work with the character. But for this case, again, if you watch the video, you'll understand why I did it this way. And what I wanted to talk about in this video is some of the issues that arised with this pose and how I dealt with it. So the first thing is that you can notice that the hands are crossing the legs. And the problem with this is when you're working with dynamic topology, it will merge these objects. However, in this case, if I grab this and I move it around, it's gonna lag a bit. You're gonna notice that it is not attached to the leg. The way I chose to do this with this character is by taking advantage of this line web over here, the web. And to show you what I did is, let me just first go to only render. I basically separated the lower part of the body over here from the upper part of the body. This way I make sure that I get to keep the parts over here that are connected to the body attached, because otherwise it would look weird if I didn't, and I deattach it in a place where we don't really see the character. And that way we can rig the upper part of the body without having to worry about these two parts messing up with each other. Another cool thing that I did with the character when creating him in this pose is, let me just remove the only render. I created the character on an armature. That way I don't really have to wing the pose. So what I did is hit the Shift A button and create a human rig armature. If you don't have this over here, just activate it in the add-ons. And I explained all of this basically in the top 10 tips of sculpting in Blender. You can check it out. Once I did that, I went to edit mode with the tab button. Hit the T button to make sure that you have the X-axis mirror activated, so that when you move one section over here, it'll move the other one as well. And then I just basically just pose the character, so I can just grab the whole part over here like this with the B button for box, and I can just move the character around. And once I was done, I created something similar to this. So this is actually an armature, and the reason it looks different is, yeah, a bit of flagging because the file is heavy. If I go to this icon for the rig, I can just change from stick to the first one, and this is basically what it looks like. Once I was done with this, I just sculpted the character over this to get the pose right away. Okay, so now for the part that I'm pretty sure most of you guys are excited for, the suit. So we're going to talk about the texturing and rendering in a minute. Let's just put it aside. For now, I'm going to talk about how I created the web. It's actually quite simply technically, but it took a lot of time to do, and you're going to know why in a second. So first thing I'm going to do is very similar to the way I did the eyes, which I showed earlier in the video. Shift A and create a plane. Tab, then Control Tab to switch to vertex mode. Alt M, merge the vertex at center, and make sure to activate the snap tool. Once you do that, if the snap element is at face and you grab the vertex and move it anywhere around the body, it's going to snap on the body. So this is perfect. So I'm going to do a really small part over here just to demonstrate how I did the web. You can extrude the vertex with E. So I'm going to extrude and make a square shape like so. I'm going to close it off with F. There you go. And if you want to better visualize what's going on over here, just go to this icon, the square one. And if you go down to display, you can activate X-ray. Just keep in mind, if you do that and you have some of the mesh on the other side, it can disrupt the view. So let me just remove this because we don't need it for now. Delete. Let's go back to the web. So here what you can do is basically use the Control R button to create some cuts. Here I created the point, so Control R for another point. And when you grab this vertex, you can just snap it on the body. So I'm going to create another one over here, grab it and move it to the other side. I'm going to grab this one and do the same for all the sides over here. And you're going to see why in a second. It's going to be very, very clear. There you go. Okay, perfect. And we can grab this vertex and then extrude it with E and do the same again over here, and then connect it with F with the other one. And if you grab all of these vertices over here, so these two, and hit the F button downwards like this, you will basically close it off. So we're gonna do the same thing right here, and I'm gonna do it a bit fast. There you go. And finally, I'm gonna close this one off. So I think by now you get the idea of how I created the web, but just before we move on, let me show you some important things about this. Now we can add a modifier. So first of all, I added a mirror modifier so that I don't have to redo it on the other side. And I also added a solidify modifier so that we can add some thickness. Now don't be fooled, the thickness is actually inwards right now. It's because we have the X-ray activated, we can't see it. So we're gonna have to deactivate the X-ray over here and change the thickness to make it go outwards like this. Once you're done with that, we need to add a subdivision surface to make it look smooth. And that's pretty much why it took a lot of time to do the web, because if you're going to add a subdivision surface, you're going to have to add some support to the topology. So by hitting the Control R button over here, you can add an edge and you can move it around to the edge of the other two vertices. So if I do it here in wireframe mode, you can see what's going on. Control R, click once, and then you can move it around with the mouse and then click again. And when you do that on all sides, you're gonna get something a bit like this. And you're pretty much going to have to do that on the whole web. So you can imagine how much time that's gonna take you. Now, once you're done with that, sometimes in certain parts, you're going to have to add more vertices. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If I grab these vertices over here, E to extrude, I can maybe add it over here, and I can do it over here as well. Then Control R and Control R over here, and then I can close off these vertices like so. There you go. And then I'm going to do what I did earlier. And once you do that, you're going to notice there's one problem, is that if you rotate, it's not touching the object or the body. And that's because you don't have enough support in the middle. So you're going to have to add support over here and then grab it for it to snap on the body. Since we have the snap tool activated, we can do that over here. And keep in mind, I'm actually snapping both of the vertices together, but that's not really a good idea because it doesn't really take both of the vertices into account when it's doing it. So you're going to have to separately grab one, use the G button to snap it again on the body, and the second one as well. And the same for the support. So when we added the support, we're going to have to grab the vertex over here and make it snap on the body. But anyways, that's to make a really clean look at the end. Another tip I can give you before we move on to the next step is that before adding the support, make sure that you create the whole web first, because it's a lot easier to change the shape of the web if you didn't have as many vertices as you do over here. So if I want to change the shape over here right now, I'm going to have to change even the support edges as well. So now if I show you what the edit mode of the final web looks like, you're going to notice that's exactly like the example that I gave you. So here, if I deactivate the subdivision surface modifier and the solidify modifier, this is the first layer of work that I did, minus the support edges that's at the end once I was done with the whole web. And then I added the solidify modifier to get this, and because of the edges, the supporting edges that I added when I added the subdivision surface, it looked pretty smooth. One last thing I want to show you before going to the texturing phase is the spider icon. I'm not going to really show you how I did this one because it's exactly the same way I did the eyes, which I showed earlier in the video. What I want to show you is that once I was done modeling the spider on the body with the snap tool, and obviously using a mirror modifier to get the other part exactly symmetrical, I just duplicated this one and put it back over here. But instead of using the snap tool to move all of the vertices, as you can see over here, there are a lot of vertices, so I don't want to have to redo it. What I did is I went to add modifier and I added a shrink wrap. So if I remove it, this is what it actually looks like. So this is the same as this one. Now just make sure that the mesh is not touching the body, and once you add a shrink wrap modifier, it will basically shrink to the surface that you choose over here. So in target, just choose the object. The body is called sphere 13, and you can play around with the offset as well to move it around. And that's pretty much it. Just don't forget, you can add other modifiers like solidify to get some thickness. You can add a subdivision surface, but when you add a subdivision surface, just like the web, you're gonna have to play around with the topology and add some support to some areas to get a really refined look around the spider. And now for the most exciting part, the texturing and rendering of the character. Okay, so we're gonna take a look at the node setup and the textures of the character. Just make sure that you have the node wrangler activated in the add-on section of the user preferences, so that when you use the Control and Shift click button on any node, you can see what's going on. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab the upper body and just separate it. it's basically the same thing with the rest for the node and the texturing. So I'm just gonna go over this one. Okay, what I did here is, first of all, I started with a red base color, as you can see. The way I created this is by, let's see, if you go to texture paint and you hit the T button, you're gonna get these options. Make sure obviously that you have your character unwrapped. I did a really quick dirty unwrap with this character. I didn't even retopologize the character, just for information. And once you're done with the unwrap, you can create a texture over here by just hitting the new button, create one. And hopefully you guys know how to do that, but if you don't, it's already covered in the texturing course that I have on my Gumroad. So moving on, what I did is go to fill, and I selected use gradients, and then I chose two colors, so left and right. I chose a red and a bluish color over here, a dark one, and I basically just used a gradient this way to create something similar to this. Now obviously for the red I went for something more saturated, and you can just play around with the line. There you go. This is pretty much what it looked like at first. And once I was done with that, let me just go back to the texture. There you go. I added some wear and tear, some difference in saturation, hue, and brightness all over the shirt so that it does not look boring and it looks a bit more realistic, because in real life, you know, it's not just one color, and especially for a superhero suit, I'm guessing that, you know, because of all the fights and everything that's going on, that the suit has a lot of wear and tear and different in saturation and stuff like that. So moving on, once you're done with this, you can create the second texture, which is the blue one. Now for the blue one, I created it the same exact way. I used a gradient. As you can see, it's a lot brighter in the top than in the bottom. And then I added some difference in color, saturation, hue, the same way all around, except you're gonna see here over here in the middle, I didn't, because in the final result right over here there is no blue, so I didn't really bother with that. And the way I separated the red from the blues is by creating a mask texture. So I created another texture that looks like this. There you go. And I painted one part white, one part black. And when you do that, you can just create a mix node over here, Shift A, you can search for it, mix, so mix RGB. And when you do that, you can add the mask in the factor. So basically what I'm telling you over here is that the first node, which is the red one, will only be visible in the black area, and the white node, the white section, will have the second node, so the blue area. So if we take a look, this is the red one and this is the blue one. Once we mix it together with the mask, this is what we get. Pretty simple. Okay, let's move on to the hexagon pattern. So for the hexagon pattern, I could have created it in Photoshop, but I was lucky enough to find a free texture online on Pixabay. So it's basically this one over here. I just searched for hexagon pattern and I found this. This is stylable, so it's perfect for the suit. So what I did is I created an image texture node. Now in case you don't know how to do this, just Shift A, search image texture node, there you go. And then you can create a mapping node and a texture coordinate node so that you can play around with the scale of the texture and choose whether the texture reacts to the UV map or it's generated. So you can play around with these and see what different results you get. Now if we take a look at the texture, there you go. I'm going to duplicate it over here. Take a look at it by default what it looks like. So it looks like this, and when I added the mapping and generated to it over here in the vector, I got something more like this. So if I zoom in, you can see it's repeated a lot of times, and that's because I played around with the scale. So I changed the scale to 20 20 20, and I made sure that I changed this first part from color to non-color data. And I did that, you usually do that with bump maps and any texture that you don't really need the color information. And I also changed the section over here from flat to box, just so that I can get the blend option. But apparently from what I'm seeing over here, I ended up removing it. And the reason I did that is because since I did not properly unwrap the character, you can see some seam issues over here, for example. And with the blend, if you just slightly change this, you can see it kind of blends together. It's not a perfect texture job, but it gets the job done when, you know, the texture is really small like this, so it's fine. But if you wanted something really proper, you could have done a UV unwrap where you create the seams in sections in areas we don't see. So for example, if I take a look, let me just put this back to 0. If I take a look at the final render over here, if you created the seam around this area and around this area and created the UV map that way, you could have gotten, well, I could have gotten something that's a lot more proper. But anyways, it worked pretty well for the character this way, so I got away with it. Now, once I created this texture, I basically added a bump node, and you can do that by hitting the Shift A button, search bump. There you go. And with this node, you can create a bump map with a black and white texture. So the way this works is you connect this to the height. So let's just take a look at this over here. That's what it looks like right now. If I attach this node to the height, you get something like that. So right now the bump is a bit too strong. I played around with the strength, so I decreased it to around 0.3, something like that. There you go. And you get something that's not that strong. So I'm going to remove this and go back to this one. And this is what it looks like. And once you connect the normal over here to a principled shader, so the principled shader, again, Shift A, search, PR, there you go, principled shader, there you go. And if you connect it to the normal, this is what you get. Now, if I remove it, you lose some of the bump. And it also affects the glossiness and how the light reacts to the object. So it's very important that you add a bump map. Okay, so once I was done with this, I wanted to make the pattern a bit more obvious, because if I remove this node over here, this is what it looks like with the red texture, the blue texture, and the bump map. This is what it looks like. With this new node over here, we get the pattern, it looks a bit more obvious. And the way I did this is by basically creating a mixed shader with this one over here, so mix RGB. And then I added the red and blue texture to the second node. And for the first node, I changed the color to a dark black. And then I attached the color node of the image texture of the hexagon. I added it to the factor. So I basically used it as a mask. If you remember over here, I used a mask to add the red and blue color separately. So I did the same thing over here. And I basically changed the color to black so that we get this over here. If I change the color, you're gonna see what's gonna happen. There you go. That's what happens. So anyways, once I was done with this, I connected this node to the base color to get the final look. Now you can take a look at the rest, but you can see that I didn't really change much. So I kept the roughness at 0.5, the specular at 0.5. I could have added a roughness map to get a bit more realism and change the values, but it turned out to look pretty great. So if we hit Ctrl Z right now and we take a look with the lighting and everything that's going on, it actually looks pretty awesome. And if I go out of the separation mode over here and I do that again with the webs and everything else, there you go, it looks pretty awesome. So for the lower part of the body, even the webs over here, it's pretty much the same thing. So let me just show you what it looks like, as long as Blender doesn't lag. There you go. So it looks very similar. I just didn't add all of the complicated, you know, separating the reds from the blues for the web, because we don't need that. But I still use the bump of the pattern, and I just made the scale a bit different. So I changed the scale and I made it repeat a lot more because the object is smaller and I don't want it to be as obvious as the rest of the body. Okay, so let's take a look at the rendering, the nodes, the lighting, and everything I did to finalize the character. First thing we're going to talk about is the lighting. So for the lighting, two things. The first one is I used an HDRI image from hdrihaven.com. Now that website has a lot of free HDRIs, so you can go check it out. It's an awesome website. And basically by default, you actually get something like this. So you don't usually get the environment texture mapping and texture coordinate, but you get something more like this, where if I hit the Shift Z button right now, and take a look at what it looks like. So this is what it would look like. Now, if you put the strength to 0, we wouldn't see anything, right? So I'm gonna remove this and take a look at the background with the HDRI. So I played around a bit with the strength and I added all of these nodes. So the mapping and texture coordinates are pretty straightforward. I already explained it earlier. I played around with the rotation over here to change the way the HDRI affected the character. And that's pretty much about it. Now, if you don't know how to access this, it's actually quite simple. Make sure you're in the node editor. By default, you have the cube icon activated. This is where you get the nodes for the clothes. You can simply switch it to the earth. I'm just guessing you already know that if you're at this point, but anyways, just in case, there you go. So moving on, the second set of lighting is just 2 sun lamps in the back over here. So if we take a look, they're set at 3. Now this is going to change from scene to another. I added some low saturated color of blue to add some interest, and finally it gets something like, hold on, let me just change the strength to 0 just to show you what the rim light looks like alone. So this is what the lighting looks like with the 2 sun lamps, and it adds this really nice rim light around the character that separates him from the background and gives this really awesome look for the character. So if we take a look at it with the HDRI, let me remove it. So this is what it looks like without the rim light, and this is what it looks like with the rim lights. Perfect. Okay, so another thing you're gonna notice is that the character is emitting shadow on the floor, but when we go to the rendering mode, we did not see the floor. The way I did that is by 2 things. First of all, go to this icon, the first one, the scene one, and go down to film, activate transparent so that you don't see the HDRI image. And once you do that, just create a floor for the character. So for example, this one, it's a very simple one. It's just a plane that I extruded, and I added a subdivision surface modifier to make it look smooth. And once I did that, I went to this icon, so the cube. You can go down to cycle settings and just activate the camera and shadow catcher. Now, if you don't have the camera activated, it won't take into account when you're rendering the whole scene, so make sure it's activated. And the shadow catcher basically does this. Let me show you. It's a lot simpler if I show you. So if I didn't have this activated, we would see the floor in the final render, but I didn't want to see that because I wanted to do my own composition later on. So I just added the shadow catcher to get the shadow information over here. Okay, so at this point, the character is pretty much done. Just before hitting the render button, what I did is go to the second icon and activate the AO pass. So this is ambient occlusion. Hopefully you know what it is. And it basically allows us to have this pass over here in the composition section of Blender, where we can add it to the character with a multiply node. It's actually not really called multiply node, it's called a mix node, and you can switch mix to multiply over here. Anyways, this is basics of composition. I won't cover it over here because the video is already packed with information and it will make it much longer. So anyways, going to the third icon, I'm using Filmic. If you don't know what Filmic is, go to YouTube, search for it. There is a video that explains it pretty well. I think it's by Blender Guru, so go check it out. And it basically gives some better dynamic range of blacks and whites or something. It really makes things a lot better in the composition section for me and for the lighting in the scene. So what I did is I changed the look from base contrast to very high contrast because by default the character would be very desaturated, and that's pretty much about it. That's when I hit the render button. I did some composition in Blender. I ended up doing a bit more composition in Photoshop and I got the final result. A small shout out to my Instagram and Twitter. You guys can follow me there for more artwork and other stuff. Also, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, learned a lot of things. If you did, like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I'll see you guys in the next one. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more awesome character sculpts and art related videos. You can also check out my store for full courses on character sculpting, texturing, materials, brushes, and more. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, then you will definitely enjoy the next one.